1, and the host of Madison Bookbeat on WORT Radio, where he is also vice president of the board of directors. A former president of the Bassett Neighborhood Association and a Dane County supervisor, he has also chaired the Madison Landmarks Commission, Community Development Authority, Plan Commission, Zoning Board of Appeals, and several other city and nonprofit boards. A graduate of the UW Law School, he served as a mediator-arbitrator for the Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission from 1987 to 2015. So that was a mouthful. Stu is going to be recording the presentation tonight. We wanted to let everyone know that. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but absolutely feel free to raise your hand during the presentation if you have a question, and I will try to take note of that and let you ask your question in the moment. And then you can also submit questions to me in the chat function, and I can ask them for you if you prefer to do it that way. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Stu.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you, Eli, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. It has been a while since I lived downtown, so I'm happy to at least have this opportunity for a virtual reconnection. The money shot the skyline from Lakeside Street, and to tell you the truth, the 1920s was a pretty terrible time in Madison. There was civic frustration as the city failed to meet several longstanding challenges. City Hall was over 60 years old. There was no municipal auditorium. There were traffic and parking problems downtown. The trolley was in trouble, yet the city made no progress on any of these critical issues. Even worse were the tragic side effects of prohibition. There was violence, there was corruption, there was a police department filled with members of the Ku Klux Klan. And even on campus, many of the university's best and brightest young leaders created and joined an honors fraternity named after the Ku Klux Klan. It was such a bad decade, we actually tore down Frank Lloyd Wright's first Madison Commission and failed to build two others, which he designed. Now, there were some bright spots. There was tremendous change downtown. There were new schools east and west. There was progress for parks and planning as the city finally adopted some of the key recommendations from John Nolan's Madison, a Model City. But finally, because it was just that kind of decade, the city's most important politician, who never held city office, its two greatest private citizens, and a pivotal philanthropist all died. Here are some of those stories. Here's a quick map showing, and I'm sorry that I don't know of any way to get the images of the screen, of some of us off the screen, so we'll lose a little bit of the image, but you can see here are just some of the things that happened in the downtown, in the immediate Capitol and Upper State Street area in just 5 or 6, 7 years downtown. Everything from the Capitol, to the new theaters, to the Tenney building, new hotels. We'll talk about some of those throughout this presentation. Here is the square in 1920. This is what the square looked like when the decade began. And there were actually a greater number of important buildings from the 1850s than from the 20th century. And among them was the first important office building, the Bruin Block, built at the corner of East Washington Avenue and South Pinckney Street. That's the red arrow, or the deep orange arrow. That was built in 1853-54. Notice the very small store at the corner of Pinckney and Mifflin Street. That's the yellow arrow. The orange arrow going horizontal, that's the water tower from 1893. Big changes in just 2 years. The water tower is gone. You can see the first central bank building has opened. That's the red arrow at the corner of Pinckney and East Washington. That would last until 1970 and be replaced by what we now know as the Glass Bank. The vocational school has opened. That's the blue arrow. And you can see a very nice clear shot of the 1871 post office and courthouse. That is the white arrow. You can't quite see it because of the faces, but just off to the right is the homestead of a mayor from the 1870s. Let me see if I can move this image. Oh, no, I can't. let me get back. Just off to the side is the homestead of Mayor Andrew Proudfoot from the 1870s. And here's what I was talking about, all those buildings from the 1850s. All the orange arrows in this image are buildings built in the 1850s. From left to right, the Willett Main building, or home of Miles Teddy Wedger, Grace Episcopal Church, City Hall, the Madison Hotel, and the Atwood building. The last two of those would last until the 1960s. So they'd go from the 1850s to the 1960s. And of course, only the Miles Teddy Wedger building and Grace Episcopal last today. The buildings built between 1922 and 1927 in the other colors, in the red, Madison Gas and Electric, in the blue, that's the Wisconsin Power and Light. In the green, the Lorraine Hotel. In the pink, the Masonic Hotel up at the top, and the Belmont Hotel over in the yellow. All of those except the Madison Gas and Electric building remain. That, of course, was taken down for the Overture Center about 20 years or so ago. Also, you can see the Belmont Hotel and the Lorraine Hotel, two of Madison's most important hotels, opened within a few months of each other in 1924. And this is an important story about downtown development. And the story starts in 1921, when the state enacted a law which John Nolan had recommended in 1911, which set a height limit of 90 feet for buildings on the Capitol Square. That was part of his recommendations in Madison, a model city, to preserve the view of the Capitol. It was not enacted in time to prevent the gay building from being built, but a couple of years after the gay building was built, the legislature finally enacted that law. In January 1923, a Milwaukee hotel operator named Walter Schrader tried to buy the Grace Episcopal Church site and offered $350,000 to build a hotel. The congregation said no, so a few months later, Schrader bought the land where Mayor Proudfoot had lived, which you see where the Concourse Hotel is now. A few months after that, the state Supreme Court struck down that 1921 statute setting the 90-foot limit as an unreasonable exercise of the state's police power and a taking without just compensation. And the city acted very quickly, and just 3 weeks later, it issued a building permit to the Piper brothers to erect a 115-foot Belmont Hotel, the yellow arrow at the corner of Pinckney and East Mifflin. Immediately after that, the legislature enacted a 100-foot limit. The Pipers challenged that law and kept building. A few months later, the court upheld that new statute setting a 100-foot limit around the Capitol Square, but said that the Pipers' permit was valid because it had been issued under the ordinance of the time, and that compliance would cause an annual loss of $25,000. That's why the Belmont Hotel is as tall as it is. Walter Schrader proceeded to build his hotel, and in June of 1924, he opened the 8-story Hotel Lorraine, the city's most luxurious and largest hotel. A few months after that, in September 1924, the Belmont Hotel opened, the tallest building in the city at 11 stories, with a decidedly different clientele than the Concourse. The Concourse was a luxury hotel. The Belmont served traveling salesmen with $2 rooms and $1 extra if you wanted a private bath. And it's very interesting that those class distinctions have remained, because the Lorraine, of course, which had for a while was the home of the State Justice Department, has been converted to upscale condominiums, and the Belmont Hotel now houses the YWCA. So the class distinctions which were created at the time the buildings were built have been continued even as they're no longer hotels. A nice view of the Isthmus to the east from 1928. Notice the difference in the tree coverings on either side of the Capitol. Look at the extent of the trees on West Washington Avenue in your neighborhood compared to the trees on East Washington Avenue in the industrial zone on the east side of the Capitol. And that's another representation of how the geography of East and West affected the development patterns of East and West, and how the East is the industrial side because it's flat and not as verdant as the West side, which became the professional and university side and is much greater tree coverage. Here is the square in 1929. By the summer of 1929, the post office and courthouse, that's the red arrow on the far side of the Capitol, has opened. So the original courthouse and courthouse and post office, the white arrow has been torn down. You can see behind the post office, the Madison Club, and that there's nothing happening on the Fairchild property at the end of Monona Avenue. And this is what, and you see again, the Belmont Hotel, the First Capital Bank, the school, the vocational building, and off to the corner, the gay building. Now, this is what's happening on the square in 1929. Here is what's going on in Monona. Not much at all. The development had really not hit Monona at this time. And I'm sure there are some homes along Toniawatha Trail and Frost Woods, but you can see Monona is still very rural and undeveloped at all. Here is the Isthmus in 1932. And again, we see, let me get this, we see another 4 buildings, 3 of which remain. From left to right, Manchester's department store, which has been replaced by Manchester Place. The Montgomery Ward store, which is now the Madison Children's Museum. The Tenney building, that's the 3rd red arrow from the left. And 1 West Wilson, originally called the Capitol Annex, in the corner of the building. So this is what the square looked like just at about the depths of the Depression. 91 years after this photo, most of the buildings in this photograph remain. This is from late fall 1929. I will note that the Commercial National Bank, by the way, was organized by Stu Levitan and his friend August Pawnak. August Pawnak developed a lot of the Westmoreland neighborhood. And there's in fact a Pawnak Street there. Stu served as president and chairman of the board of this bank even while he was state treasurer, which is something I don't think would be acceptable today, but in the ethical standards of the 1920s and 30s, that did not raise any eyebrows. In addition to its significance as in the city's social and cultural and economic life, State Street also showcases an amazing array of architectural styles. We've got Italianate, Queen Anne, Romanesque Revival, High Victorian Gothic, Craftsman, Prairie School, Tudor Revival, Mediterranean Revival, Art Moderne, and Art Deco. And that's essentially just in the first 2 blocks. And I tried when I was chair of the Landmarks Commission to get people interested in creating a State Street historic district. I wasn't able to do it, but I still think it is something that is important to preserve this great architectural legacy, which eventually is going to fade, but it remains, and it's something that we should take great enjoyment in. And of course, the second block of State Street, the 1920s is the time that State Street's identity as a shopping center and entertainment enclave begins. And it shows the relationship between commerce and entertainment. To the left, we see Frank Kesenick's Grand Emporium for Women's Dry Goods. This was designed by Frank Riley, Madison's best architect. That is the French Renaissance revival style. Cost $250,000 in 1923, and it really sparked the street's commercial development. It replaced a traveler's hotel from 1856 called the Knowlton Hotel, and it really jump-started State Street. Across the street, you can't quite see it, is the expanded Hills Department Store, which was the successor to a dry goods store founded by who else? Stu Levitan. It served mainly middle-class shoppers. And then after those two stores opened, then we get the great theaters, both of which were designed by a Chicago firm named Rapp and Rapp. And they opened within a year of each other. On the right, the $1 million new Orpheum, quite possibly the first use of Art Deco for a theater exterior. Across the street, the Spanish Revival Capitol Theater. Now, some thought the $18,000 63-foot tall sign of the new Orpheum was a bit too big and garish for State Street, but the city council thought it would make the city more metropolitan and more exciting. So it actually amended the sign ordinance to allow that sign to be built. And naturally, the Capitol Theater sign soon followed. Here are some of the interiors of the respective theaters. On the left, the new Orpheum Theater, dedicated March 21st, 1927. Mayor Schmiedemann gave a welcoming talk. The headliner was Will Hidgie, the man who had introduced the Charleston dance, and he unveiled his latest dance, the Higgy Jig. And 7,000 people came to see Madison's first movie palace for 3 performances of vaudeville and filmed photoplays. In January 1928, the Capitol Theater opened. About 6,000 people came to see that. Governor Zimmerman said the building, quote, rivals our great state capitol for which it was named. It may even come to rival it as a place for entertainment. You may recall the Capitol closed in July 1974. It reopened in 1980 as the Oscar Mayer Theater in the Civic Center. It was substantially altered and its original name restored in the second phase of the Overture Center in 2006. Now, just as several important buildings opened, one important building was torn down. This gorgeous boathouse at the top of North Carroll Street was Frank Lloyd Wright's first public commission in Madison, and it was torn down with no public notice that it was. It was commissioned in 1893 through an open competition by the Madison Improvement Association, and here are some of the people who contributed to its $4,600 price tag. See if some of these names are familiar. Hotelier George Fess, furniture maker Christian Frautschi, editor-publisher B.B. Clark, UW President Charles Kendall Adams, Mayor Philip Spooner and his brother Senator John Spooner, Mayor Robert Bashford, Mayor Silas Pinney, Mayor Breeze Stevens, Governor Lucius Fairchild, jurist Burr W. Jones, industrialist diplomat Hallie Steensland, attorney and parks philanthropist Daniel K. Tenney, and the La Follette Law Firm. Are any of those names familiar, perhaps, as people with buildings or parks or streets named after them? But when it was torn down, even Wright's most zealous supporter, Capital Times editor-publisher William T. Eviu, didn't note its significance. Here's what that wonderful building looked like from the lake. And I hate to say it, but it was torn down because the good people of Mansion Hill did not want the hoi polloi who needed a public boathouse around, because they all had private piers. And that's why it was torn down by the people who lived on North Capitol Street to preserve their privacy and their sense of being, Mansion Hill residents. This was not the only indignity the master suffered this decade, because there were 2 interesting designs which were commissioned but never built. And this is what happens when the world's self-proclaimed greatest architect designs a golf course clubhouse. This is the Nakoma Golf Clubhouse designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1924. Originally, the plan was for the clubhouse to reflect Northwoods, Wisconsin, with pine logs and native boulders. But somehow, through family and friends in the neighborhood, Frank Lloyd Wright got the contact and produced this bizarre combination of a teepee, which he called a wigwam, a Japanese tea garden, a carport. This wonderful model was created by Bruce Severson for an exhibition at the Elvium Art Museum about 30 years ago. Unfortunately, or fortunately, a combination of inaccurate cost estimates and Wright's personal scandals doomed the project, and in 1930, the club dedicated a traditional neo-Gothic structure designed by the architect to the Nakoma Homeowners Association and sent Wright away with $3,000 for his work. And this is what happens when the world's self-proclaimed greatest architect designs a fraternity house. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's design for the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity house at 16 Langdon Street. In late 1924, the Fijis decided to build new quarters. And Richard Lloyd Jones, the former editor and publisher of the Wisconsin State Journal, an influential member of the chapter's alumni board, cousin to Frank Lloyd Wright, and unfortunately, the man who was editor-publisher of the Tulsa Tribune, helped provoke the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, wanted to get the contract for his cousin Frank. So, and Frank was world famous by this time because Frank had designed the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which was one of the few structures to survive the devastating earthquake of 1923. So this was a coup to get Frank Lloyd Wright to design the Fiji frat house. And to get the full flavor of fraternity life, Frank Lloyd Wright, who's 58 years at that point, shows up at their old quarters at the corner of North Henry and Langdon Street and says, "Hi, I'm Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm going to stay with you for a couple of days and see what fraternity life is like so I can design your new fraternity house." So think of Frank Lloyd Wright bunking with the Fijis for a week in early 1925. He shows this design to the fraternity leaders at Taliesin in April. The best plan for a house that has ever been submitted. They are just thrilled. And the State Journal said, the most unique of all Madison Greek letter houses, not very grammatic, but enthusiastic. Certainly it would have been the only frat house designed as a Mayan temple built out of cinder blocks, built out of concrete blocks. But unfortunately, tragedy struck. There was a lightning fire at Taliesin, lightning strike at Taliesin, started a fire, did $500,000. Frank only had $40,000 in insurance. On top of that, in December, Frank's personal scandalous life flared into the news again. His young mistress, Olga, who was married to another man, gave birth to their daughter, Iovana. Now, the Fijis were not bothered by personal scandal. After all, the Fijis were the fraternity that founded the honorary fraternity of the Ku Klux Klan, which we will get to in a moment. But so they kept working with Frank even through all this scandal. But then their contractor, John Findorf, another name you might recognize, told them that Frank's estimate of $80,000 was about $20,000 off, another story you may be familiar with. So they asked Frank to redo it, and he revised his plans, even while he is on the run from Olga, husband. There's an arrest warrant out for him. He and Olga are on the run. He's redesigning the Fiji frat house while this is going on. They eventually catch him up in Minnesota. And about the time that they catch him up in Minnesota, hiding in a cabin, the plans come in still at $100,000. The fraternity cancels the contract and hires a firm that Wright absolutely disdained, Law Potter, the initial firm for Potter Lawson, one of whose partners, James R. Law, would become mayor in the 1930s. Wright disdained him, absolutely disdained James R. Law. And the building you see now, which appears as a very modest manor house from the street, but a massive estate from the lake, is James R. Law's design, built on a conceptual model of Frank Lloyd Wright to separate the frat house into three separate sections of entertainment, study, and residence. And that's how the building was structurally designed. James R. Law just gave it a more traditional look. Now, and again, when it was opened, press accounts did not note the original architect. Now, only a mile from Mansion Hill as the crow flies, but a world away, was the neighborhood where the decade's most sensational stories occurred, the Bush. And here's a brief lesson in cartography and terminology. The Greenbush edition, that's outlined in red, and that one orange line, was bordered by Regent, Mills, Erin, and Murray. It was platted in 1854 as the full Greenbush edition. The Pregler's edition, that's in yellow and a little bit of the green, is bordered by Murray, West Washington, and Regent. That was platted on landfill, an old marsh, in 1900. The Triangle Urban Renewal Area, Regent, West Washington, Park, Mound, Brooks, Milton, and Mills, that's the green and yellow, that was adopted in 1960. So technically, the Greenbush and the Triangle are different areas. Today, however, when most people say the Bush, they mean the area encompassed in the Triangle Urban Renewal Area. Here is the most important secular building in the Bush, and perhaps the most important private sector building in Madison from the 20s to the 60s, Neighborhood House. Thomas E. Brittingham Sr. bought, this was a former furniture store at 768 West Washington. Thomas E. Brittingham Sr., who is a Parks philanthropist, excuse me, starting to cough a little like Joe Biden. Thomas E. Brittingham was a lumber baron and Parks philanthropist who in 1920 bought this former furniture store and gave it to the Public Welfare Association for Neighborhood House. The Kiwanis and Rotary Clubs paid to convert it to a full settlement house, which opened in November 1921. The head resident was a woman named Gay Braxton, another name you might recognize. And Gay Braxton said the purpose of Neighborhood House, quote, was to educate foreigners to adjust themselves to American customs and methods of living. Because apparently people who were from the Italian ancestry that went back thousands of years, or the Sicilian ancestry that went back thousands of years, were not quite up to knowing how to cook and clean and needed to be schooled in modern American ways. And in fact, the Lions Club undertook a comprehensive Americanization program and adopted Neighborhood House as its chief civic project. Braxton retired in 1949. Neighborhood House joined the Madison Neighborhood Centers. This building was raised in 1964 for the Triangle Urban Renewal Project and was replaced by a building at 29 South Mills Street. There were healthy baby programs at the Neighborhood House. There were programs and activities for neighborhood youth representing 7 nations and 3 races. In 1924 alone, there were 30,000 visits to Neighborhood House, over 1,500 separate activities or meetings. This is why I say it was the most important secular building in the neighborhood, if not the entire city. Come on. There we go. This is where the boys of the Bush played ball, a toxic industrial brownfield. Does anybody recognize the street in the background? And Jackie, you can't say anything because you know. Does anybody recognize the street in the background? It's got houses dating to the 1840s. The street in the background is Bedford Street. This is the site of the school administration building. This is where the former Washington School was. This is the corner of Dayton and Bedford Street. And this is adjacent to the Conklin, this is adjacent to the railroad tracks and the Conklin Oil and Gas Company. This is where the children from the Bush had a ball field on what today would be an industrial toxic brownfield. This is the bush and the triangle in 1960 gives you a sense of what was torn down for the Triangle Urban Renewal Project, and gives you a sense of what it must have looked like in the 1920s, because very few of the buildings in that area date past the 1920s, and most of them date from decades before. The 1920s, as I said at the outset, was a time in Madison when the 20s in Madison howled with this terrible mix of corruption and violence and evil. There were murders in the bush, a Klan-infested police department, even a crooked judge. And this was all thanks to the noble experiment of prohibition. Now, Greenbush had some great moments early in the decade. The Italian Working Men's Club opened in 1922 on Regent Street. It was built by neighborhood volunteers using equipment donated by the former city engineer named John Ickey. And that would be the neighborhood's social focal point for generation. In 1923, a new St. James Church, designed by the master architect Ferdinand Cronenberg, opened on St. James Court. But just a few blocks away was the intersection they called Dead Man's Corners. It was Desmond Court at Murray Street, halfway between Regent and Milton, about where that white mark is. 5 men were shot to death at that spot between 1922 and 1928. And it's my belief that if there's an intersection that the newspapers can refer to as Dead Man's Corners in a headline, and people knew what they were talking about, that's not a good thing. For the full decade, in the 17 blocks outlined in orange, there were 11 fatal shootings, including 2 police officers and a 2-year-old, and 2 bombings, all related either to bootlegging or old world vendettas. In 1924 alone, there were 5 fatal shootings, usually with a shotgun, and 1 bombing. And the fact that the crime and violence involved Catholic Italian immigrants was of great organizational benefit to the Ku Klux Klan and their popularity within the police force. Most members of the police force were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and Klansmen who weren't cops sometimes enjoyed official sanction and special status. And many felt that the president of the Police and Fire Commission, Dr. E.H. Drews, was at the very least a Klan sympathizer and may have even been a member himself. The Klan started organizing in August 1921, and by October 1922 had 800 local members. And when the Klan planned a full induction ceremony on a farm south of town, Mayor Milo Kittleson said he, quote, saw no reason why they should not be given the same consideration as any other organization. In November 1923, the Reverend Norman B. Henderson, pastor of the First Baptist Church and president of the Lions Club and the Ministerial Union, called the Klan indispensable in the fight against liquor and, quote, the best friend the Negro in the South ever had. In July 1924, 2,000 attended a burning of a huge cross at the first regional Klan conclave at Miller's Park on the Oregon Road. They held another one in October after Mayor Kittleson issued a parade permit. 2,000 Klansmen marched unmasked through the bush and around the square, then down to their favorite pasture south of town for another conclave. And here is a photo you may have seen. It's a very famous photo. Masked and robed Klansmen marching to the Schrader Funeral Home for services for the rookie patrol officer Herbert Drager, who was murdered in a shotgun ambush at Milton and Murray Streets. 2 neighborhood men, Salvatore DiMartino and Frank Vitale, were arrested and identified by eyewitnesses, but later found not guilty by a Sauk County jury. Drager was on the job for only 6 months and was the first police officer in Madison to die while on duty. This is King Street in Madison, Wisconsin. And here are the Klansmen at the funeral at the funeral home in Middleton, at the church in Middleton. I don't know if Drager himself was a member of the Klan, but certainly some of the men we see in sheets and hoods in this photo were on the police force. And in June 1925, there was a cross burning on the exact spot where Draeger was murdered. On December 8th, 1924, 7 Sicilians tried to file an official protest against police brutality, but the Police and Fire Commission denied them a hearing. They let their attorney, Ernest N. Warner, address the commission briefly, but took no action. And yes, that's Ernest Warner, as in Warner Park, or as I like to think of him, Fred Risser's maternal grandfather. Three weeks later, Mayor Mile Kittleson and Police and Fire Commission Drews secretly deputized about 30 Klansmen to conduct raids in the bush, paid for through the mayor's official contingency account. Mayor Kittleson lied and denied the Klan connection and refused to disclose their names. 7 city officers also participated, but the police chief, Thomas Shaughnessy, was kept in the dark, and as 15 arrests were made. The Women's Club, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Baptist Church all supported the raid, and the council later endorsed using the Klansmen because it voted to reimburse Kittleson's office account for the expenses. The last major Klan event occurred in Dane County occurred in September 1925. But just 2 years before the Knights of the Invisible Empire even started organizing in Madison, there was, as you may have heard, a very prominent group here openly identifying with the Ku Klux Klan on campus. The campus honors interfraternity Ku Klux Klan. Because in the early 1920s, university life was dominated by a group of young men who proudly espoused patriotism, Protestantism, and white racial superiority. The Interfraternity Ku Klux Klan Honorary Society. It took 1 junior and 1 senior from every other fraternity. That's why it was called an interfraternity. It began with a secret meeting called in May 1919 by juniors of the aforementioned Phi Gamma Delta. It was officially chartered in January 1920, the second such organization in the country after the first one at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And interestingly, that campus and Madison also had the first and second chapters of the Jewish organization Hillel a few years prior. So maybe they organized the Klan once the Jews started organizing. I don't know, but the facts remain. Here's how important these guys were. Members of the campus Klan served in or on the student senate, the student court, the alumni committee, the prom and homecoming committees, were directors of the Daily Cardinal Board of Control, the athletic board, the YMCA cabinet, the student union board, the Memorial Union fundraising committee. These were the BMOCs, the big men on campus. Between 1920 and 1924, 4 of 5 senior class presidents were members of the Ku Klux Klan fraternity, including Walter Frouchy. Yes, that's Jerry's father. And Fred Bickle. He would win 2 Academy Awards as Frederick March. In 1921 and 22, members of the Honorary Klan edited both the Daily Cardinal and the Badger Yearbook, which published these very coarse anti-Semitic illustrations. There was an organization back then called this Menorah Club, and the illustration showed these 2 Jews with huge hook noses, a bag of money at their feet, and they're shrugging like this. This is the Badger Yearbook of 1922. The society's membership also included the future financial guru, Thomas E. Brittingham Jr., the longtime Memorial Union director, Porter Butts, football star Red Weston, future city school superintendent and elementary school namesake, Philip Falk. Now, as you know, the rooms in the Union honoring Butts and March were recently stripped of those designations. The Board of Education so far has not renamed the elementary school. Now, what I know about Porter Butts is that as director of the Memorial Union, he followed a strict policy of non-discrimination. And what I know about Frederick March is that as an adult, He was a dedicated anti-fascist and was honored for his work with the NAACP. The students of the honorary Klan were, as I hinted, very active in the bush. Sometimes they helped out with the Americanization efforts, teaching the Italians how to cook and clean and play ball, but they also played junior G-men. In early 1921, student Klansmen conducted surveillance, went to the bush, made liquor buys, filed complaints with federal liquor control agents, and actually joined in the nighttime sweep that led to 8 arrests and the confiscation of 300 gallons of liquor. And with almost no African Americans on campus, there were 3 Blacks in the freshman class of 1923, 6 in 1927. Racism and anti-Semitism were both rampant and routine. The Dean of Students, Scott Goodnight, routinely approved fraternity charters with racial and ethnic restrictions on Jews, Catholics, and non-whites. The Klan itself even got university approval for its own fraternity in May 1924 called Kappa Beta Lambda, with initials that stood for Klansmen Be Loyal. There was a Klan fraternity house at 302 Huntington Court, which had the lowest grade point average on campus and was put on probation its second year. There were minstrel shows on campus starting in 1897. They were revived after World War II and World War I, and they were important events. A highlight of the homecoming 1920 was the Engineers Minstrels, a regular old-fashioned N Jubilee featuring whites in blackface performing as Rastus, Sassafras, Dumbbells, and other nicknames. The university-endorsed souvenir program even had the caption, "Laugh at the ends." And it was the same off campus. And even as the state and local Klan faded, a 1926 minstrel show produced by Luther Memorial Church Brotherhood was so successful, it was later broadcast over the Capital Times radio station, WABA. So if you listen to WIBA today, its racism is historic. That's just a little in reference. I used to work for WIBA. I'm allowed to say that. I mentioned Thomas E. Brittingham Jr. earlier, a member of the Interfraternity Klan. Here is his father, the lumberman philanthropist and namesake of Brittingham Park and Boathouse, or as it was referred to in that era, Columbus Park, because that's where the Italians went. He died at sea in 1924. Now, Madison had this is going on its own. Madison had 2 mayors in the 1920s. Here's Milo Kittleson. And if only Milo Kittleson had not secretly deputized those members of the Ku Klux Klan as special police officers in 1924, I would think he would be one of Madison's greatest mayors, because he was one of the most, I don't know why it keeps advancing on its own. He was one of the most visionary and successful. He was the first mayor to propose a civic auditorium on the Lake Monona shoreline. He said a municipal athletic field was more important than a new city hall, and 2 years later, he opened Breese Stevens Field. He called for a high school on the east side in his inaugural address in 1920, and the East Side High School opened 2 years later. He predicted that Central High would be turned over to the vocational school almost 50 years before it happened. He fought against the use of soft coal as an abominable nuisance. He dredged Starkweather Creek and Lake Monona to deal with a sugar factory runoff. And he called for the city to buy the land we now know as James Madison Park. It was Kittleson who made traffic go one way around the square, but his plan to actually ban parking from State Street would not be realized until the first Soglin administration in 1977. As I say, a visionary mayor, if only he hadn't secretly deputized the Ku Klux Klansmen. But for all that, I think the most important thing he did, and in the long run, even more important than deputizing the Klansmen, was to veto the council's purchase in 1924 of 3 lots fronting on West Johnson Street. where that building with a smokestack is behind the cute little gas station at the corner of State and Gorham Street. That was proposed for a new city hall. Now, maybe that's an okay location for a restaurant or a brew pub, many of which have been there over the past many years. But can you imagine putting City Hall on a one-way street that is one of the two arterials through the isthmus? And not only that, but to pay $57,000 for property assessed at only $17,500. Now, we definitely needed a new city hall because the city hall we had opened on Washington's birthday in 1858. Kittleson called it antiquated and inadequate, and it was. I mean, think of that. This is the city hall that they were using in 1920. It's the city hall we were using until 1953. But what the council wanted to do to relocate to Johnson Street was even worse. Your action, Kittleson told the council, has brought forth from our people in every section of the city, regardless of personal interest, storms of protest and objections. His veto was sustained. The fight to a new city hall would continue until the new city county building was approved in 1953. Think about that. A year after, Madison was still using 6 years. Madison, at the end of the Korean War, a year after the end of the Korean War in 1953, Madison was using a city hall built 6 years before the Civil War. Speaking of which, here is the other great mayor, the other mayor of the 20s, Kittleson's successor, who was born the 4th year of that Civil War and died the year after World War II ended. The only Madison mayor to be elected governor, a first-generation German-American graduate of Madison Public Schools, started as a clerk for a downtown clothier, became a partner, ran for the council in 1904 to get a school for the 4th Ward, and he did. You know that building today as the Doty School condominiums. Alderman Albert Schmiedemann is the guy who got that building built as a school for the 4th Ward. He was on the Police and Fire Commission and the school board. For some reason, I still don't understand, President Wilson named him ambassador to Norway and kept him in office throughout his term. It was Schmiedemann who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of Wilson in 1919. King Haakon of Norway awarded him the Grand Cross of the Royal St. Olav Order for getting supplies past the German blockade. He was mayor from 1926 to 1933. Mixed record. He was good on urban planning. He proposed that the city require developers to set aside land for schools and parks and fire stations in new subdivisions. He built the West Side High School, expanded east, built some more grade schools, but otherwise vetoed other large projects. He was the one who cracked down on the Klan in the police department. He fired Drews from the Police and Fire Commission. And so during his 4th term, somebody burned a cross on his lawn. He became the first Democrat elected governor in the 20th century. But in 1934 was defeated by Phil LaFollette. FDR then made him housing administrator for Wisconsin during the New Deal. He's in a wheelchair in this photo because he hurt his ankle dedicating Rib Mountain State Park during the 1934 campaign. Gangrene set in and his leg was amputated. He died the day after his 82nd birthday. As I say, he was good on the Klan and planning, not very good on religious diversity. Here is his Good Friday message from April 1928. Whereas all religious denominations are participating in a general movement to commemorate the crucifixion and death of our beloved Savior, by holding divine services between the hours of noon and 3 o'clock on April 6th, I respectfully request that all business establishments in the city of Madison close from noon to 3 in order that all persons may have the opportunity to fittingly commemorate the suffering and death of our beloved Savior, Jesus Christ. All city employees are hereby excused from their usual vocations during this interval. Now, lest you think that is shocking, it was not until fairly recently that the state allowed state chartered savings and loans to be open on Good Friday afternoon and city employees to work during that time. So this was not unique, but I thought it was a little flowery that all religious denominations were observing the crucifixion and death of our beloved Savior. Now, I want to talk about 3 road projects. I want to talk about 2 road projects that thankfully were never built. And this next slide may be the most important one in this whole program. Now, some of you may remember that it was not until 1966 that University Avenue was made one-way westbound, except, of course, for the wrong-way bus line, now the bicycle lane, coming east. Until then, University Avenue went both ways. Its eastbound traffic turned down Bassett Street and then left on either Johnson or West Washington, creating lots of traffic jams. And what the planners recommended was to extend eastbound University Avenue from that bend at Gorham Street with a 150-foot right-of-way all the way to West Washington Avenue, also widening West Mifflin Street to 100 feet and taking the streetcar line off State Street. The planning consultant said the congestion is becoming too acute. We need to evolve for some future traffic in this vicinity. John Olin, the man who founded the Park and Pleasure Drive and hired John Nolan, championed this highway expansion. Mayors Kittleson and Schmiedemann advocated it in several annual messages. It was considered a higher priority than a civic auditorium or a new city hall. A majority of aldermen supported the construction. And in April 1926, they put a $285,000 bond issue to start purchasing property on the ballot that spring in April 1926. Every civic leader and elite endorsed this. And in a sharp and unexpected rebuke to the experts and the elite, the people overwhelmingly rejected this referendum, as you see, 86-39 to 46-52, because they said, no, we would rather save our neighborhood. We'd rather live with traffic jams for a few more decades and save these blocks for hundreds of units of housing, a large city parking ramp, a grocery, the headquarters of Alliant Energy and Wisconsin Telephone. And what this slide reminds me is that sometimes the experts are wrong and the people are right. And I say this as someone who, as you noted, spent 25 years chairing one land use commission or another. And it's a story that I probably should have remembered more often, that sometimes all those people who don't have the credentials and the expertise and the offices and come in and speak from their heart and their experience and their personal knowledge know what they're talking about, and the experts maybe don't. This is a very important slide. This is my favorite slide in the whole project, in the whole talk. And this was not the only ambitious project that hit a dead end. Now, Harlan Bartholomew was a rising young star in the field of urban planning. The Plan Commission hired him in 1920. They liked his zoning text so much they approved it a month after its introduction. This is his proposal how to deal with the traffic jams created by the railroad. Now remember, in this day, there's no causeway. The Monona Causeway isn't opened until Thanksgiving 1967. So in this day, to get south, you had to go out West Washington Avenue. And the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad ran 17 freight trains, each containing 50 to 75 cars through Madison every day. With another 20 or so passenger trains coming to the West Side Depot. And those of you who are of a certain age will remember that to go along West Washington Avenue, anytime up until the fall of 1967, you were pretty guaranteed to get blocked for minutes or a half hour. If you had to commute along West Washington Avenue, you'd be blocked at some point during your commute, one day or the other. And this was Bartholomew's solution: a grade separation with 6 tracks raised about 12 feet above a reconstructed West Washington Avenue subway that would submerge 6 feet down on a 4% grade, which created enough clearance for a streetcar. This plan, or a variant of it, would be a central issue in city business and politics for the next 30 years. In the late 1940s, they were still having public meetings in the Central High Auditorium that 1,000 people would attend to debate whether or not to build this. And the city kept trying to get the Milwaukee Road to relocate, at the very least, the roundhouse and the freight operations. But even though the Milwaukee Road chairman was a Madison native named Leo Crowley, who was a legendary New Deal administrator who lived just next to Edgewood, the Milwaukee Road refused to do anything. Now, again, adopting this plan would have substantially improved Madison's quality of life for the next 40 years, but eventually, and solved a highly divisive political issue. But eventually, the railroads declined, and shipping made these elevated tracks would have made these tracks unnecessary and unsightly. And we would probably still be debating today how to tear them down and how to rededicate the land and pay for that whole project. So again, it's a good thing that this ambitious project from Harlan Bartholomew was not proposed, was not created. It was Madison's first mayor, Jairus Fairchild, who first called for a public meeting hall in 1856. It was in the 1920s that the city's business and arts communities combined in a crusade that, as you know, would become Madison's longest running and most important downtown development fight: the location, design, and financing of a performing arts and convention facility. It did not start well. 3 times in the 1920s, the Association of Commerce got the city to create an auditorium committee, part of its plan to brand Madison, quote, the ideal convention city of the West. And 3 times the committee and the city came up empty. This is the closest they got. And this gives you a sense of why Frank Lloyd Wright disdained James R. Law and the Law Potter architectural firm. Designed by James R. Law, who would succeed Albert Schmiedemann when Schmiedemann became governor. This is a multi-use $450,000 facility featuring flat floor exhibition space and a seating capacity for 6,500 people. For some bizarre reason, the auditorium committee proposed that it be located not on the Lake Monona shoreline, but on 2 low-lying blocks on East Mifflin Street, just past the city market. That didn't matter because the council rejected the tax hike, which would have been needed to pay for it. And then shortly after the crash, and you can read how that auditorium committee continued its work in Madison in the 60s, which continues the story, which, as we know, lasted for several more decades. Here's another I don't know why it keeps doing that, terribly important building, a surprisingly significant building, because the federal government unilaterally decided to build its new post office and courthouse on Monona Avenue, exactly where John Nolan said it should go. We didn't tell the federal government to do it. The postmaster came to Madison. He almost put it where the Madison Children's Museum is today, where the Montgomery Ward building was. That would have been a disaster. And he's walking, he says, let's put it here. And look how the government gave such a grand setback. making it an impressive building, far more than what the private sector did when it built that Beaver Insurance building in the next block, blocking the view of the Capitol. And that, by the way, is on the site of another Frank Lloyd project that wasn't built, the proposed Madison Hotel of 1912. Think how impressive what's now Martin Luther King Boulevard would be if the private sector had as much sense as the federal government public sector had in how to design along that grand mall and followed John Nolan's design for a grand mall. And you have that tremendous view of the Capitol, but instead we have the Beaver building and the rest of what's there. And you can see that the city council understood how significant what the federal government did at that time, because it passed a resolution formally designating this area as the Civic Center. Now, Civic Center didn't mean what it meant in the 80s, the entertainment place that's now Overture. Civic Center was the Civic Center for the government buildings, the state and local government buildings, perhaps a grand hotel, a theater. And the council understood that and passed this resolution. And for the most part, except for that one block, we have followed John Nolan's design in that area. A little bit about the schools. This course is the East Side High School, designed, as I said, by Madison's best architect, Frank Riley. Somewhat ironically, given some of the students who go there, it was built on land donated by a military contractor and industrialist named George Steinley, who sold the land at a discounted price to the school board of $50,000. The original name proposed was Vilas, but a citizens committee refused to name it anything connected to the university, and so it was named the East Side High School. This view is from 1925, after that rear addition is put on. And that opposition to the university is very interesting in light of this chart. And it's unfortunate you can't see the full thing, but you'll get a flavor of it. This shows the activities of the 1926 and 1927 graduates of East Side High School and Central High. Graduates who went, and graduates who went to work right away out of high school are in blue. Graduates who went to the University of Wisconsin are in red. As you can see, most of the children from the working class parents on the East Side went to work. Most of the children of the professional class on the West Side went to college. This is a very clear indication of how the socioeconomic status of the parents so affects the educational and employment futures of their children. This is a chart from the 1927 report of the superintendent of schools, and I find this just fascinating and very, very illustrative of what, as I said. And just because this is a great picture of a great guy, the young man on your left is the beloved journalist historian, Frank Custer. I'm sorry, on the right is the beloved journalist historian, Frank Custer. These are the Central High cheerleaders. That's Frank Custer on the right, his twin Rudy to the left, and an upperclassman named Monty Hacker in the middle. I'm glad you can at least see Frank. And for those going to the memorial, going to the University of Wisconsin, here is, oh, where'd it go? Oh, well, I guess we've lost the photo of the university. So I'll go straight to the fact that 4 great Madisonians died this decade. I've already noted Tom Brittingham. 1924 was the year Madison's greatest private citizen of that era died. And John Olin is a prime example of how the university brings people here whose influence extends far beyond the campus. He came here in 1874 to teach rhetoric and oratory at the university. In 1892, he founded the Madison Park and Pleasure Drive Association. In 1908, he hired landscape architect John Nolan to write a master plan for the city. So without John Olin, no Brittingham Park, no Vilas Park, no Tenney Park, no Yahara River Parkway. Without John Olin, no Madison, a model city. So if John Olin doesn't transfer from Oberlin College to Williams College in 1871, if he doesn't impress his professor, John Bascom, if John Bascom doesn't come to Madison as president of the UW in 1873, if John Bascom doesn't offer John Olin a job, if the school board in John Olin's native Ohio doesn't let him out of the contract he has already signed to be a high school principal and let him come here to accept John Bascom's job offer, we are a much different and much lesser city. That is how individuals can so affect the future histories of their municipalities. Anybody want to guess, and again, Jacqueline, you're not eligible, anybody want to guess what this is a photograph of? June 22nd, 1925. Well, it's obviously a procession of some part. There are a lot of people standing by to watch it. Doesn't quite look like a parade because it's cars and nobody looks dressed gaily. It is in fact a funeral cortege. It is the funeral cortege for Fighting Bob. They're taking Fighting Bob's body from where it lies in state in the state capitol out to Forest Hill Cemetery in June 1925. Again, Fighting Bob, the greatest politician from the area who never held city office. He was Dane County District Attorney, but never held city office. And finally, no one really knows why Michael Balthasar Olbrich hanged himself in the basement of his home at 216 Campbell Street at age 48, or the many great things he could have done had he survived. But at least we have two highlights of Madison's landscape as part of his physical legacy. He's the man most responsible for the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, and of course, the East Side Park that bears his name. And as the records of the Republican National Convention will forever show, it was Michael Olbrich, a poor farm boy from Illinois, who became a debating champion and Phi Beta Kappa at the UW, executive secretary to Governor John J. Blaine, member of the Board of Regents, deputy attorney general. It was John Blaine, it was Michael Olbrich who made the nominating speeches for Robert M. La Follette at the Republican National Conventions of 1912 and 1916. Here's how UW President Glenn Frank eulogized Michael Olbrich at his funeral. His mind was so transparently honest in its operations, his character so unreservedly genuine, his spirit so consecrate to causes beyond the boundaries of his own private interests, and his family life so saturated with sweetness and considerate devotion that I cannot reconcile to the fact that he is gone. It must be a lavish universe that can afford to allow a life like his to stop at the very moment of its flowering. But now it is time for me to stop with one final image: bright lights, big city, State Street, December 1960. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share these images and these stories with you. And again, from Madison, the Illustrated Sesquicentennial History. And I'm happy to engage any questions or have any discussion that you want. And I will stop the screen sharing if I can figure out how, and we can have our discussion. So thank you very much for that opportunity.
Thank you, Stu. Round of applause. That was absolutely phenomenal. I have learned so much. I will open it up to questions from the audience here. Any questions, feel free to either raise your hand, I'll call on you, or honestly just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. You can also send a message to me in the chat function if you want to ask a question there. No questions?
Oh.
I do have at least one myself.
I have a question for Stu. Yeah, who are some women in Madison's history that are notable?
In the 1920s, the only one would have been Gay Braxton and her longtime companion, Mary Lee Griggs, companion and associate at Neighborhood House. the women's club was, I mean, earlier in the century, the women's club would have been more active, but by the 1920s, women, you know, had just gotten the right to vote. They were not owning property, and I hate to say it, but women, other than Gay Braxton and Mary Lee Griggs, there are not a lot of women who appear in the public renown in that decade. It would not be until really, I mean, the first woman on the first woman elected to the city council is Ethel Brown, and that's not until the 1950s. So, you know, it's a fallow period for women outside the home.
Thanks.
Thank you. I did have a question. I know this was obviously time building up into the Great Depression, but I'm curious, what were the staple industries for Madison?
Oh, you know, I think if I can, let me see if I can get back to, I had this in the original thing, and I'm sorry. I took it out of that. Well, let me stop this shares. You know, I had a couple of illustrations showing that, and I was running short on time. Oscar Mayer, of course, was huge. The French Battery Company was very big. And if I can get to my PowerPoint, I had all that, and I took it out for space on time. Oscar, the French Battery Company, which became Rayovac. Let me just open the book and I can tell you exactly what they were. There's a wonderful illustration in the book of the East Side Businessmen's Association activities right before, we've got, Fuller and Johnson, of course, Fuller and Johnson on East Washington, the Burgess Battery Company. Now, the industrial life in Madison was very important because 10% of Madisonians worked in industrial jobs. 6,000 Madisonians worked in industrial jobs, whether at the Gisholt Machine Company, Fuller and Johnson, the Burgess Battery Company, the French Battery Company. So industrial life was very important, but most of it was outside the immediate central neighborhood. So I was running long on time, so that's why I took that image out. But there are some good images of the East Side industrial life in the book.
Awesome, thank you. Looks like, yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah. Hi, Stu.
Hi, Jonathan.
This is Jonathan.
Yeah.
Something early in your talk about parks made me think of the Madison Parks and Pleasure Drive Association,
yes,
which predates this era a little bit. But how did the work that the Madison Parks and Pleasure Drive Association sort of lay the groundwork for what happened in the 20s with park development in Madison? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, most of the parks themselves, the main park development in the 1920s was there were some improvements to Vilas Park. Most of the parks dated from the first decade of the 20th century. Brittingham, Vilas, Tenney are all between 1904 and 1912 or so. And the Yahara River Parkway is also in that first decade. The significant parks development in the 20s is Michael Olbrich giving a speech at a Rotary Club meeting in 1927, at which Aldo Leopold is present and some others are present, and really jump-starting the Arboretum. It was an idea that Increase Lapham had proposed in the 1850s, and John Nolan had proposed it in Madison, a model city. And as a member of the Board of Regents in 1927, Michael Olbrich got the Board of Regents to turn over. You may be familiar in the Memorial Union with a room called Tripp Commons. Tripp was in addition to the bequest that created Tripp Commons, there was $83,000 left over, and Michael Olbrich convinced the University Regents to give that to the Park and Pleasure Drive Association to jumpstart the purchase of land for the Arboretum. And that land was negotiated by Joseph W. Jackson, who was one of the great entrepreneurs and developed a lot of what we know of modern Madison. So the individual parks and were pretty much all in place. It was the Arboretum and what Michael Olbrich did, and also the expansion of Olbrich Park. So that's how the original Parks and Pleasure Drive Association crested in the 1920s.
Thank you.
Thanks. Paul, your hand's up. Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for that marvelous presentation. I'm quite a recent arrival in Madison, of which I knew nothing before I got here. And the pandemic has allowed me to walk miles and miles around the downtown. So I actually know when you say that building, I know that one. I walked past it many times. But I did, anyhow, I'm very thankful to you for that. But I have some questions about, just a few questions. Sure. You mentioned the Gay building, and we
noticed the Churchill building. It's the Churchill building immediately next to, one door up from the Museum Madison, the Wisconsin Historical Museum, that is being proposed to be torn down as part of the expansion of the Historical Museum. It was renamed the Churchill Building in the 1970s.
And that's on the same block. Is that the high rise?
Yes, it's in the, if you have the book there, it's in it was built in 1911. So there's a photo and a little caption explaining it was the first skyscraper in Madison.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, and that's the building that they then enacted the legislation to set the Capitol View Preservation Statute.
And the second question I have is about the architect Frank Riley, whom you obviously think very highly, of whom you obviously think very highly.
Yes.
And you compare him to Frank Lloyd Wright, whom you obviously do not always think of very highly. I wondered why you liked Frank Riley, who I know nothing about it.
Okay, Frank Riley, he designed, well, are you familiar with the old facade on the Overture building?
Actually, yes, I've seen it.
Okay, that's the remnant of the Kesniks or the Yost Kesniks building. He designed that. He designed a number of the great fraternity houses on Langdon Street. He designed a number of great houses in University Heights. He designed the Security State Bank in Shanks Atwood. He designed East High School. He was a master of several different styles. He could, oh, you want French Renaissance Revival? I can do that. You want Tudor Gothic? I can do that. Lived in a house on the East Side. He was a master of many different styles and stayed within budget, and his roofs didn't leak. Frank Lloyd Wright was,
visionary.
Frank Lloyd, I mean, yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Tokyo Hotel, and it survived the earthquake of 1923. That's great, but he designed buildings that functionally made no sense. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright, the Guggenheim. I don't think Frank Riley could have designed the Guggenheim building, but I don't think Frank Lloyd Wright would have designed the Security State, or could have designed Security State Bank. It's what Bob Dylan said to Keith Richards: I could write Satisfaction, but you couldn't write Desolation Row.
Before, one last thing, can you mention a fraternity building that Riley designed that you think is particularly good?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I can get those two. I mean, he designed a number on that street and a number of houses in University Heights. Obviously Frank Lloyd Wright was brilliant. I mean, come on, yeah, Taliesin, yeah. But some of the stuff didn't work. I just think Frank Lloyd Wright was, if you needed something designed and built, I'd have gone to Frank Riley.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. I see 3 hands up.
Great.
We'll take Andrew, Robert, Lowen, Bob, and then Bert as well. So we'll go with Andrew first, since your hand was up.
Thanks, Stu. It's nice to meet you. And like Paul, I'm fairly new to Madison, so I feel like I've gotten to peek behind the curtain, and it's such a treat.
Okay, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
From your perspective, what aspect of this part of Madison's history needs to be grappled with and reckoned with most today in 2020? And what would that look like?
Well, it would probably be the extent of Klan involvement in the police department. Yeah, I mean, the fact is that in the 1920s, you pretty much had to be a member of the Klan to get a job at the police department. There was an expose in 1927 that they had something called the Bow Tie Club, and you had to, it was code. You had to show your membership card in the Bow Tie Club to get hired, which was a cover for the Klan, to get hired for the Madison Police Department. And here's why that's, and think about the passage of time. And those of you who are around in the 1960s, reflect on this. If somebody joins the force in 1925 as a 22-year-old and is a member of the Klan, they may very well still be on the force in the 1960s. They may be those cops who came into the Commerce Building in 1967 and cracked heads. If they weren't working alongside former Klansmen, then at some point in their career may well have been working alongside former Klansmen. Think of the continuity of time. Think of those Klansmen in the force through the 20s, and just because the Klan was gone by 1925, 26, 27, the Klansmen were not. And if they're Klansmen through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, they're cops in the 60s who worked alongside them. And those are the cops who came into commerce and cracked our heads. And I think that's a very important thing that's a very important perspective. And I don't think there's a legacy of the Klan today on the Madison Police Department, but certainly around the country, we see something about people who are attracted to police work all too often are also attracted to certain authoritarian and discriminatory concepts. Obviously, not all cops are racist. Obviously, not all cops discriminate or are neo-fascists. I don't want to imply that, but there are too many police forces in which there is too much of an overlap. So that would probably be how I would answer that question.
Thanks, Stu. All right, Bob Lowen, you're up.
Hi, Stu, thank you for the talk. Enjoyed it very much. Had a question about a passing comment you made about a sugar business.
Yeah.
Refinery. Talk about sugar in Madison, Wisconsin.
Well, the Sugar Castle out on Sugar Avenue, we know it as the Garver Feed Mill. If I said Garver Feed Mill, would you know what I was talking about?
Sure.
On the Far East Side, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, well, in the early 1900s, I would say maybe 1906, Magnus Swenson. Magnus Swenson was an industrialist who invented a method of extracting sugar from sugar beets, and it was a big deal. And the building that we now know as, well, the Garver Feed Mill or the Garver, whatever it's called now, was originally the Magnus Swenson. It was the sugar factory where it was 4 stories, and they extracted sugar from beets, and the residue, the detritus, flowed down Starkweather Creek into Lake Monona, and it was environmentally just horrible. And there's some wonderful photos of these little girls in front of the Sugar Castle, and that's why it's called Sugar Avenue. But that's what the sugar factory was. That's what the sugar business was. Magnus Swenson was a very interesting guy. He was a food commissioner during World War I. He's the guy who got Bob La Follette expelled from the Madison Club on grounds of unpatriotism and disloyalty, because Bob opposed the entry into World War I. And the lawyer who told the Madison Club they didn't have to give Bob notice at the meeting at which they're going to expel him was our friend Burr W. Jones. So a lot of this stuff all comes around. But Magnus Swenson, very interesting guy. Brilliant guy. Magnus Swenson was the city chemist in the 1890s who convinced the city that we needed a municipal water supply and to get rid of backyard wells, because the backyard wells were filled with typhoid from all the bacteria and the feces. So Magnus Swenson was historically a very important man who did great things for public health and economy, not the environment and not Bob La Follette.
What years approximately did that sugar mill or refinery operate?
I want to say it opened in, the sugar beet factory opened in 1906 and it closed in about 1924, 1906 to 1924. And here is a picture, you can barely see it, but here's a picture of the sugar factory. It's tough to see. So 1906 to 1922, 23.
I had no idea that sugar was ever done here. That's interesting.
It was from the beets. It was from the sugar beets. I mean, that's, yeah, it was big business.
And I say goodnight to you from the Lorraine Hotel 7.
Well, enjoy. Are the elevators any faster than they used to be? My God, when I worked at the Justice Department, those were the slowest elevators in town. They were terrible.
We have among Madison's fastest.
Okay. Well, times are changing. Somebody else?
Two more questions. Bert, you had one? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. You're muted. You're muted.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah, you're muted at the moment.
I'm wondering about the Ho-Chunk presence in Madison in the 1920s.
The main residue of the Ho-Chunk presence in the 1920s was the dedication ceremony of the Nakoma Country Club when they had, and actually that's something else that I took out of the talk because it had gotten too long, but when they dedicated the Nakoma Country Club, they had a full dedication ceremony with a peace pipe, and they scattered tobacco on the ground. And Frank Lloyd Wright's original design also reflected some of the teachings that Charles Brown had given him regarding the importance of the Ho-Chunk in the area. There were Native American imagery around the facade inside, but I believe all the Ho-Chunk were gone, had been relocated by that time. I'm looking to see if I can find more details from what I cut out, but the main, had Frank Lloyd Wright's Nakoma Country Club been built there, okay, so yeah, I mean, the thing is that where the Nakoma Country Club is built had been Ho-Chunk summer campgrounds as recently as the mid 1800s, but by the early 1920s, the Madison Realty Company had created the Nakoma Plat and they were gone. At the dedication ceremony, there was a Winnebago feather flag, a peace pipe was propped up, a tray of Indian tobacco was scattered to the winds, and an offering was actually made to the Great Spirit. And as I say, Frank Lloyd Wright's design for the Nakoma Country Club clubhouse did have Native American imagery inside, but as to Ho-Chunk themselves, they had been relocated as far as best as I can tell.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stu. All right, I have one quick question, and then I'll move on to wrap up with the final door prizes. I always think about the lake. I love the water. Were there any big plans in the 20s regarding the lake shore?
Not really. People did not fully understand the value of it. It was not, I mean, the reason why James Ty has to do all that work today with the Lakes group is to try and fix the problems that we created for decades and decades. As I say, even the first proposal for a convention center wasn't on the lake. So we don't see much lake, we don't see anything really in the 20s. And then by the 30s, we're in the Depression. In the 40s and 50s, we start seeing some proposals for water breaks and stuff in Lake Mendota around what we call James Madison Park, what was called Conklin Park then. But the lakes were not a high priority at the time. There were so many other things that we weren't doing yet that the lakes were not yet a high priority.
Awesome. Stu, if anyone has any follow-up questions, can they reach you?
Sure.
Do you mind through your email, do you prefer, or what's your preference?
Yeah, I can put my email in the chat. I'll put my email in the chat while you're doing the wrap up.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you again. It's been a while since I gave this talk, and I think I remembered most of it, so it was fun to do. So thank you very much. And again, and Michael, I want you to pay attention to that thing about the people sometimes know better than the experts. That University Avenue thing. I mean, just think if the mayors and John Nolan and John Olin had gotten their way. Think how your neighborhoods would have been devastated, and that to me is the single most important slide in this whole presentation.
I got it, Stuart. Thank you for the reminder. I concur. It would have been an absolute disaster.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks so much for your presentation.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stu. Okay, folks, turning over quickly to my Excel document. Let me just put in my equation here. I will announce our second door prize winner, and it is Hillary. Hillary, are you still on? Yes, Hillary SK. And very quickly, one more here. We have a third door prize, one of these hefty books with amazing photos in it and amazing content. Oh, that's easy. Andrew Stevens. I can just drop it off in front of your door. We live in the same building. Awesome. So, Stu, did you manage to put?
Yeah, I put my email in the chat.
Great. Yep. So if you have questions, follow up with Stu. And with that, thank you all for joining us tonight. Happy holidays. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe.
Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Stu. Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Bye. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Rich, if you're still on, Richard. No, he just hung up. Okay. Hillary, are you still on?
Yes.
Good. I wanted to talk to you. How would you like me